Welcome to this explainer. I want you to close your eyes for just a second. Imagine the sound of flowing water, morning sunlight stretching across an endless plain, and birds circling above reeds swaying beside two mighty rivers. We are going to explore a remarkable civilization that predated almost all of the ancient wonders we know today. It's a story of survival, human ingenuity, and a mysterious group of sacred powers that would eventually become known as the Anunnaki. To understand just how staggeringly ancient this civilization was, we really need to reframe our historical perspective. Thousands of years before the rise of Egypt's Great Pyramids, before Stonehenge stood complete, and before the first Chinese dynasties even emerged, a remarkable civilization was already flourishing in the fertile lands between two rivers. They were literally the pioneers of the modern human experience. The Greeks would later call this incredible region Mesopotamia, meaning, quite literally, the land between rivers. Those two world-shaping rivers were the Tigris and the Euphrates. Every year, they flooded the surrounding plains, bringing life-giving nutrients to the soil. But, living between these mighty rivers was not exactly a peaceful, pastoral dream. Here is the immediate problem they faced. Unlike the highly predictable, gentle flooding of the Nile River in Egypt, the Tigris and Euphrates were violently unpredictable. Sometimes they flooded gently, sure, but sometimes devastating force. Without any warning whatsoever, a flash flood could wash away entire crops and villages overnight. The environment was completely unforgiving. To survive here, people realized they basically had to master nature itself. And you can't tame a mighty river alone. They dug massive canals stretching for kilometers, built defensive dams, and engineered incredibly complex irrigation systems. These were colossal projects that no single family could ever accomplish. So, for perhaps the first time in human history, large-scale human cooperation became the literal foundation of civilization. As that unprecedented cooperation led to better harvests, the population absolutely boomed. Small farming villages rapidly transformed into the world's first bustling megacities. Names that still echo through history today: Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, and Nippur. Each of these cities was fiercely independent. Each had its own ruler, its own patron deity, and its own towering temple dominating the skyline. Section 1. Uruk, center of a growing world. To see how this all builds, let's focus on one specific city that stood head and shoulders above the rest around 5,000 years ago, Uruk. Enclosed by massive, imposing walls, Uruk's population reached an astonishing 40,000 to 50,000 people. Think about how extraordinary that number is for a world just figuring out how to build cities. It was a global hub where merchants traded copper from Oman, timber from the mountains, and precious stones traveling hundreds of kilometers. This was no isolated settlement. It was the absolute center of a growing world. But with a population that massive, city administration faced a critical problem. How do you count thousands of sheep? How do you track seasonal grain harvests, record taxes, or manage workers? There is simply too much complex information for the human brain to remember accurately. Memory alone was no longer enough to keep society running. And so the Sumerians created one of history's absolute greatest inventions: writing. At first, it was surprisingly simple. A scribe would press basic shapes representing grain or livestock into wet clay. But over generations, these symbols evolved, right? They became highly sophisticated, eventually turning into cuneiform, a complex system of tiny wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay with a reed stylus. What started as a simple bookkeeping tool completely transformed the human experience. Cuneiform became humanity's first great archive. Laws, deeply emotional poetry, religious hymns, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine could now survive long after their creators were gone. History itself could finally be recorded. The crazy thing is, they developed systems that still heavily influence our lives today. They adapted the wheel for carts. They revolutionized agriculture with bronze tools. But incredibly, they even divided the circle into 360 degrees, a mathematical standard we still use in navigation. And if you look at your watch right now, that 60-minute hour and 60-second minute ticking by, you can trace those directly back to Mesopotamian mathematics. Pieces of the Sumerian world are literally still hidden within our own. Section 2. Living by divine will. Now, despite all these astonishing technological leaps, daily ancient life was brutally unforgiving. Floods destroyed crops, droughts threatened famine, and disease spread quickly. But to the people of Sumer, these hardships were not random chance. They believed deeply that every disaster and every blessing reflected the direct will of the gods. When rivers flooded destructively, the gods were speaking. When harvests failed, the gods demanded attention. Religion wasn't just a part of life, it dictated every single decision. To maintain desperately needed harmony with the divine, they built awe-inspiring, immense, stepped temples called ziggurats. These weren't just pretty monuments. To the Sumerians, they were literal, physical bridges between humanity and the heavens above. The gods dwelled above, but through rituals and offerings, their presence could safely descend into the temple to bless the city. The gods they worshipped were incredibly active participants in everyday life, making up the divine assembly. You have major, powerful figures here. Anu, the lord of the heavens; Enlil, the master of wind, storms, and authority; Enki, the clever god of wisdom and freshwater; Inanna, the wildly powerful goddess of both love and political power; and Ninhursag, the great mother goddess of earth and creation. Together, these specific deities and the sacred elemental powers they represented were known collectively to the Sumerian people as the Anunnaki. Yep, this is exactly where that famous term originates, right here, in the mud and clay of the world's first cities, representing the highest pantheon of the divine assembly. I want to be crystal clear here, because there is a lot of misinformation out there. In historical reality, the Anunnaki were the awe-inspiring forces of nature itself, sacred powers deeply woven into ancient daily life. The modern myth that the Anunnaki were mysterious extraterrestrials, that is entirely a modern science fiction interpretation, literally invented thousands of years later, and not supported at all by the original texts. Believing they were guided by these sacred powers gave the Sumerians incredible confidence. They truly believed they lived at the very center of creation. Their massive cities physically reflected cosmic order. And their kings, they weren't just politicians, they were representatives ruling by strict divine approval. If the city prospered, the gods smiled upon him. But if disaster struck, his relationship with the divine could fail, making those temples linking earth to heaven absolutely crucial. As time went on, empires rose and fell, and new conquerors swept through Mesopotamia. But generation after generation of scribes dutifully copied these myths into wet clay. Because of that dedication, these stories endured. Without the Sumerians, humanity would have no written creation stories, no epic flood myths, and absolutely no records of the Anunnaki. They preserve the oldest religious traditions known to us. Which leaves us with a fascinating, profound question to explore as we look toward these ancient, surviving texts. Who exactly were these mysterious beings in the eyes of the ancient scribes who worshipped them? Were they distant rulers of heaven, the literal creators of humanity, or the ultimate judges of the dead? That is the mystery we are left to ponder, directly from the minds of the people who build civilization itself.